Okay, so let's continue our discussion about community ecology. So we talked about interactions between organisms and communities. We shall talk about trophic levels. I mentioned this in class, at least one of my class. I don't think both of them. About trophic levels. It's a good thing to know about. And we'll give this a kind of structure in terms of energy when we talk about plants more, producers a little bit more, but we should just a basic level. You should understand that all life kind of depends upon energy being brought into a system and then being passed from organism to organism through a chain, right, of like a food chain, from simple things that actually are producers, which capture energy in some form, usually sunlight, right, and use that to help form biomass. And then those organisms are eaten by something, and then they're eaten by something, and they're eaten by something, and they're eaten by something, right? So those are trophic levels. So primary producers are the things that actually capture the energy initially and form an organism, right? So these are photosynthetic organisms, usually plants, phytoplankton in the oceans, plants on land, right? And then you have something that eats those. Those are herbivores. Those are predators, right? These are primary consumers. They consume something to get all the nutrients they need, right? They consume plants. These consume phytoplankton, right? And then something eats those to get what it needs, right? So carnivores will eat herbivores, right? Carnivores eating herbivores, yeah, in the ocean example, right? And then something might eat those, right? So snakes eat mice, tuna or some bigger fish eat these smaller fish, right? And then something will eat those, right? So raptor eating a snake, killer whale eating tuna or some sort of big fish, right? So these are different levels. Primary producers, then you have primary consumers, the first level of consumers, and then secondary consumers are the second level of consumers. Then tertiary consumers, the third level consumers, and then quaternary consumers, fourth level consumers. You should be thinking about where humans land on this. It's actually fairly complicated, right? We can eat anything along these things. We generally eat plants and herbivores mainly, right? But in theory, humans can eat any of these things. You can take a weapon, shoot it down, kill it, eat it, right? Now, what you might expect though is you get less and less benefit from eating these because there's fewer and fewer of these out there, right? Because as you go up the trophic levels, the number of organisms gets smaller and smaller, right? Because the amount of energy brought into the system by the producers is the limiting factor, right? And as you transfer that energy from organism level to organism level, you lose some. And so the number of organisms that you can produce that are primary consumers or secondary consumers is decreases quite a bit, right? So this is an important consideration. But humans tend to eat anything on here. We're just good at that, right? Okay, so this results in the concept of the food web, right? We have phytoplankton at the base of the web, and then like krill, for example, copepods will eat phytoplankton, and then they will be eaten by fish and squid, and right, and then seals and stuff will eat those, but not necessarily all of them, and all different levels here, right? And then whales will eat some, but then baleen whales will eat actually krill, their main source of food, right? So they go here and they don't eat like at this level or this level, right? And then humans, of course, will eat all this stuff, right? So where you are in the food web depends upon your eating methods and right, and what you tend to do, right? So baleen whales, krill, sperm whales will eat squid and fish probably, but squid mainly, right? Humans will eat squid and we'll eat sperm whales and we'll eat baleen whales and toothed whales and we'll eat seals in some communities and we'll eat fish and we'll eat birds, maybe even krill, not so much phytoplankton probably, but right? So we kind of sit all over the place in these food webs. All right, so here's a partial food web, right? You have a sea nettle type of predator, right? It's jellyfish essentially. It'll eat zooplankton and fish eggs, for example. The eggs hatch, become fish larvae. The sea nettle will eat those too, right? Fish larvae or juvenile striped bass love those, right? So they'll eat those. Fish larvae will eat zooplankton though, right? So you get these complex things going on, right? Now, there's a concept of keystone species, which we'll talk about in class a little bit, right? But it's a species which has a disproportionately large effect on its natural environment relative to its abundance, okay? So here's an example. So in tide pools in California, the California coast, the Pacific coast, you have starfish. The starfish are the keystone species. If you remove the starfish, this whole ecosystem goes bananas, right? Totally screws up everything, right? Because you're removing a species which is really important for maintaining the structure of the ecosystem, right? So Pizastar is a type of starfish, right? And if you have that starfish present, the number of species that are present in the tide pools is around 17 or so. I don't know if they're counting what type of species they're talking about here, animal species or what, but anyways, whatever it is, right? So we have like this, and it remains relatively constant. If you take the Pizastar out experimentally, right, you just remove them, and they're not there anymore, then the number of species goes way down, actually. Ironically enough, you'd think if you took a predator, starfish are predators, right? They predate mollusks mainly, mussels and clams and stuff, right? So if you don't have those, everything goes haywire, right? The number of species goes bonkers. It goes way down, right? Okay. So this is a keystone species. There's not that many of them because they're a high level predator, right? They're high level trophic level. They're on a high trophic level, right? But if you remove them, they screw everything up and they change, all the trophic levels get messed up, right? It's keystone species, right? Okay. Here's another one. Sea otters is considered a keystone species, right? If you have your otters and they're not being predated on, otters will tend to have high numbers, and they'll keep sea urchin populations under control and control kelp density. Well, no, okay. So sorry, let's start again. So kelp is the producer here, right? Primary producer, and the sea urchins are the primary consumer, and then otters would be a secondary consumer, right? Okay, so back in the old days, when the sea otters were not around, back in the 70s in Pacific coast, right? There also weren't a lot of sea urchins and a lot of kelp because the whole ecosystem was screwed up, right? But then when in the 80s, sea otter populations were strong, right? This kept sea urchin populations low, and kelp did very well, okay? But then orcas started coming back when they were been driven almost to extinction also. And the orcas came and ate sea otters, right? So this is a high level predator, tertiary consumer, right? And the sea otter populations went down, right? Well, then that allowed the sea urchins to increase, and that resulted in kelp populations being lower. So you can see that having sea otters around here resulted in changes in ecosystem structure, and you remove the sea otter, you get big changes, right? So this was, sea otters are considered a keystone species in this case. Okay, so how does this work? So like sea otters eat sea urchins. Okay, great. All right, decrease in sea urchins allows kelp beds to flourish. If sea otter numbers decrease, you get an increase in sea urchins and a decrease in kelp, like we saw here, right? Increase in sea urchins, decrease in kelp, right? Sea otter decline possibly due to increased predation by killer whales. Why are killer whales eating more sea otters? Because there are fewer seals. Okay, this is like these long-term effects. Why are there fewer seals? Because there are fewer fish. Why are there fewer fish? Because people are eating the fish. Why are people eating all the fish? Because people like to eat fish and they're reproducing rapidly and they need lots of calories to support these big populations. So we eat a lot of fish, right? So these are these ripple effects of behaviors of different organisms in the trophic pyramids and in the food webs cause these huge effects, right? So humans eating a lot of fish impacts kelp populations, like so. Okay, all right. This is a side note. There's a disease that's wrecking sea star populations on the coast. I actually posted a link about this on the course page this week if you want to read about this. Not sea star wasting disease in particular, but the impact of kelp, kelp forest ecosystems and how they're doing in the Pacific coast actually recently. And this is influenced by sea star wasting disease, which is killing major predator, of course, keystone predator, right? sea stars and so on and so forth. Okay, now let's talk about ecological succession real fast. This is the idea of what happens to an ecological system after it's been disturbed, right? So we had Mount St. Helens here in the early, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, which was perfectly fine. It was not an active volcano at that time, or had not erupted. And this is all green and nice and healthy forest, right? And that was this own ecosystem. And then this volcano blew up, right? Went bang and obliterated all this area, right? This is called primary succession. What's basically done is the result of the eruption of the volcano kind of, more or less, not completely, but basically sterilized this whole area, right? So it's a lifeless state. And it is succeeding. In other words, stuff is growing back now. So you get certain types of plants coming back, and trees are starting to grow back now. This is not necessarily, this is an older photo, but more recently this would be starting to start trees in here as you get close to the mountain, right? Things are growing back and coming in. That's called succession. There's a certain way this actually happens. Secondary succession is when you actually have an area that's disturbed, but basically the soil's left intact. It's not sterilized, right? And there's a good example. It's actually, look at the PowerPoint. There's examples of succession in Andover, right? Where areas that were forested became deforested, and then were allowed to become reforested. Again, sanctuaries is a good example of that, right? We have all these different areas around campus where things have been found that were put in, artifacts like places to sit, and building foundations and stuff, that have been allowed to just go wild, right? And those areas that used to be lawn and whatever have now been succeeded by forest, right? Let's see if I can pull this up. Answer is, oh, sorry. Take a minute. Okay, so here's some examples of secondary succession on campus. Let me just, so, all right. So what I did is I went around campus and just photographed areas, which I had archival photos of the space, and then took photos in 2011, last time I did this, that and compared them, right? So sanctuary is a good example. This is not very, okay, here we go. So here's this rock found area. You see trees around. This is pretty clear in the front. And this is all being grown. Rhododendrons are growing up around it, right? It's all much more kind of enclosed in by plant growth, right? Secondary succession, right? Here is Upper Sanctuary Pond. There's actually a diving board here. You can see when the sanctuary opens up again, go and take a look at this. This is a beach along right near the dam. And there's a swimming platform. The boys in Andover, because back for women are allowed at school, would swim in here, right? And I found this location and took a photo. And here it is. Here's where the diving board would be. That swimming platform would have been right here. And I think the beach is right here, right? And this looks totally different, right? It doesn't look the same. Trees are much taller back here, right? This is all grown up around here. It's wild now. That's secondary succession, right? Used to be a bird sanctuary, of course, the sanctuary. And this is, again, Upper Sanctuary Pond from the bridge and the inlet area, and a little spittle of sand in here, which would form this where we're looking at here now. This is what it looks like. Here's that little spit. All the ducks and stuff would have been right around here in that photo, right? Quite different. Here's Sanctuary Forest. It's all grown up. View from the log cabin, right? You can see the chapel. I mean, the chapel and Sam Phil, right? And the clock tower. And now, well, actually, now you can't see anything. The trees have all grown up around there. This is for the log cabin. Used to be a putting green in the log cabin. There's a log cabin there, back behind it on the lawn. It still kind of looks the same, not that much different, but the trees have grown up around the log cabin, got bigger, right? Okay, Rabbit Pond's a great example. Here's Rabbit Pond. This is a view of Andover. right? Here's Rabbit Pond. This is GW, right? And we'll have cars in the parking lot around GW. This is the circle here, right? And this is probably Samville. You're taking a photo from Samville, GW there, and right. And that looks kind of like that now. I didn't get the same perspective, but see all the trees are going. Can't even see Rabbit Pond anymore. Cows in Rabbit Pond. Here's an old picture of Rabbit Pond. Another one. There's the Memorial Rock. Here's what it looks like now. Right. Just do hockey on the pond, and now you can't see any of this anymore. All right. Okay. So that gives you an idea of how succession works, right? Things grow up when they're allowed to do so. Okay. All right. So there's examples of this that people have studied. Glacier retreat in certain areas over the past couple centuries is good examples of this. Here's Glacier Bay. Glaciers used to extend all the way out to the Pacific Ocean here, all the way to 1760. But since then, they've been retreating very rapidly, and the glaciers are way back, and you can take a cruise ship all the way back here to see the glaciers now because they've retreated so far back, right? And succession's happening, right? So close to the glacier, you get these kind of shrubs and stuff, right? These are called pioneer species, right? And then as you get further and further away from the glacier edges, the succession's getting more and more advanced and more mature, right? So you get shrubbery and then big forest trees, right? So the spruce stage, you get spruces down here where the glaciers have retreated for the longest, right? And as they get closer and closer to where the glacier edge is, you get less advanced growth, right? Okay, that's enough of community ecology, and we'll do some other ones later. All right.